As you may know, a few days ago, astrologer Patrick Watson and I engaged in a discussion during which Trump's prospects were examined, and Patrick brought out the fact that next year, in April, specifically, you see the red line here, the exact date, when there will be a Jupiter Uranus conjunction near his midheaven. Patrick surmised this could be very helpful to Trump in that Jupiter being the great benefic and Uranus being connected quite frequently to individuals that have served as presidents when their sun sign and Uranus happen to be the same sign, such as, for example, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama, indeed the three previous presidents to Donald Trump. And so here we see again another example of an individual with the Sun conjunct Uranus, and Jupiter being the great benefic suggests authority figures helping him out, which could be anyone in the government system, such as this. But specifically, what came up was the notion of judges, for example, letting him off the hook, refusing to sentence him, something very helpful. Certainly, when we think of this, immediately someone like Aileen Cannon, the loose cannon judge from Florida, comes to mind. And all of this is indeed possible. You look at the chart, his Jupiter is very strong. He was born on a Jupiter station within 3 hours. This is a very powerful Jupiter. And he has a trine from Jupiter to his Sun and Uranus, and a sextile to his Moon. All of that is really good in terms of the Jupiter delivering something positive. But then we can examine this to look a little deeper, and we notice that by the logic of planets circulating their natal energy, and this is true. I have seen this repeatedly during my entire life of astrology, which goes back decades. Indeed, I use it as a hard and fast astrological rule. Planets circulate the energy of birth in the transits, and so a planet that is supportive at birth, strong at birth, will likewise behave in that way in later transits. But conversely, if a planet is weak or has problems, will also bring those problems into play. And this Jupiter, at first glance, is very strong. Stationary, trine the Sun, sextile the Moon, trine Uranus as well. Great. However, it also squares the 12th house region. If you take these planets and coalesce them, you end up somewhere in the middle of the sign. And if you take midpoints of Saturn, Mercury, or Venus, Mercury, again, you get the middle of a sign. So this planet is squaring the 12th. The 12th in Trump's life is very clearly a criminal house. This is where he commits crimes. And in any case, the 12th is not a good house for anybody in the context of what he's experiencing. 12th house is very spiritual. Trump doesn't go there in any way, shape, or form. When I say it's very spiritual, on the high end of what the house can manifest. The low end is criminality. Hence, you would associate monasteries and prisons with the 12th sign. Now, Patrick's argument was that because he was born on an eclipse, the moon was eclipsed, therefore, his enemies, 12th sign, are also eclipsed, and this is why Donald Trump is so slippery, and he defeats his enemies over and over. That is a good interpretation, and we also have to say, irrespective of enemies, this is still his moon, and his moon rules the 12th. That is going to weaken his moon on that account. On one level, because why? Because he's criminally minded, because the moon rules the 12th, for example, or that he engages in secret love affairs, which are connected to the 12th being the 8th from the 5th, and you see multiple planets there, including Venus, but also the moon rules it, and the moon is in the 5th of love affairs. So you get those kinds of interpretations, which are not necessarily as positive and have led to all kinds of problems. But he might say, well, yes, but then it doesn't matter because his enemies are eclipsed and nothing ever comes of it. Now, that clearly isn't always true, since, for example, E. Jean Carroll has taken a pretty big chunk from this guy and looks to potentially get even more. So not always 100% true that you defeat your enemies in those categories as easily. Now, the question is, what else do we see here? And so the first thing, and here I credit a number of people on the channel, at least 2 or 3 that pointed this out, this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction has the flavor of a potential health event because, first of all, notice the degrees, 2149, are actually not quite at the midheaven yet. They're 2+ degrees away. And if you look at the ephemeris, Jupiter will go right through and move into Gemini. Uranus hangs around longer because Uranus is a slow-moving planet, but the conjunction is April 20th, and there's no sense that this conjunction will last any length of time, as would be the case if you had some kind of retrograde direct motion over those degrees. It's not happening. Rather, Jupiter here moves in this direction. And so, strictly speaking, the strongest aspect it makes is near these degrees, and there you see, in this direction, a 150 to his moon. 150 degrees is the classic health aspect because it's the natural angle you get from Aries to Virgo and Aries to Scorpio. It's the 150, notorious for injury, disease, health matters, and even death matters because of the connection to Scorpio. So that begins to look a little different in that Jupiter over here squaring these planets. I pointed out the criminality, but the 12th is also a health house. 6-12 in any chart are the health houses. The 6th would be the primary, but the 12th, if anything, amplifies health matters because the 12th is where you go to the hospital. It's where things get really serious. And when you look at Uranus, you immediately see an enormous drawback to this planet because, yes, he is born with the Sun and Uranus in the same sign. The problem is that by the very school that Patrick connects to most, Hellenistic astrology, this Uranus is damaged. It's a Combust Uranus. It's too close to the Sun. This planet is a problem planet for Trump. And in fact, if you follow the movement of this planet in prior transits, it tends to correlate with periods that hurt him, often through his own actions, because he has a really hard time expressing Uranus properly. Uranus is a very independent energy. It's independence all the way to rebellion, but you can see how on the low side, this would be a kind of oppositional, rebellious energy that is more connected to the way a teenager would behave than any sense of him being a wise person. And so this Uranus in transit is not necessarily ever going to be friendly. It certainly hasn't been in recent years. I struggle to think of any instance in which he wasn't hurting himself in some way on account of this Uranus through actions he was taking that then would lead to problems later, for example. So Jupiter Uranus here now shows you Jupiter with health connections through the 12th, Uranus, a planet next to the Sun, combust, planet that can deliver problems. And now we also see that Jupiter is the ruler of Pisces and Sagittarius. So it rules his 5th and it rules his 8th. As soon as you connect it to the 8th, you're in the death house. That's extremely dangerous. Uranus is the co-ruler, at least in modern astrology. In Hellenistic astrology, they don't like to assign any kind of rulership connection to Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. I personally do, because I've observed in my own chart. In fact, I resisted this until I noticed that Uranus was affecting the Aquarius house in my chart through something that actually happened. And so from that point forward, I became convinced, yes, there's a connection of Uranus to Aquarius, which if there is, links it to his 7th. Just as in the traditional Western system, the 8th always connects to death, out of the Indian system, you will see connections of the 7th to death because the 7th and the 8th are the places where the sun sets. So it's the opposite of the place of life over here, the ascendant, where a person is born, which in his case was super late. In Leo, that's why you see 1 as the first sign. I use the whole sign system. And so you start to see that this conjunction is linking all kinds of problematic energies around health and well-being by the connections to the 8th, by the connections to the 6th as well, because Saturn is involved in the 12th sign. The fact that his Uranus in Gemini is ruled by Mercury. Mercury is also in the 12th. Jupiter is ruled by Venus. Venus is in the 12th. You get all kinds of pointers here that indicate serious potential trouble. And when you look at the totality of the transits around this time, this is something I always do, because in astrology, if you look up too close and just point to a certain event or a certain conjunction or a certain anything and you fail to look around, you will often miss the complete picture. And what you notice is, yes, there's a conjunction of Jupiter-Uranus April 20th, a conjunction that is very fleeting, but then he's getting a Saturn station which is considerably more impactful by July. And Saturn stations, you're looking at least a couple of weeks in each direction. In other words, this Saturn will move into station fairly close to squaring his Sun and Moon in the 8th. That is extremely complicated. Here I'm showing it at 15 because that's where it is on April 20th. And if I'm just looking at April 20th, the Mars doesn't look great either. This Mars at 22 degrees Pisces is directly squaring his Sun and Moon. I never see Mars in this kind of aspect do anything helpful for this guy. It just never happens. I've watched this guy's chart for years, and all you need to do is look where Mars is in terms of a challenging aspect in either conjunction, square, opposition, or semi-squares, sesqui-squares. All of that is troublesome for him. And on that day, it just so happens that Mars is directly square. That inclines me to think the event is more likely to be negative than positive. Meanwhile, if we look at the Eris, I've mentioned this before many times, it's locked in place pretty much forever meaning into the next decade, in a square to Venus, and around that time, it's in those very same degrees. Of course, that one, in a sense, doesn't really form part of the argument in a strong way, since it was already doing it the previous year, i.e. this year, and is doing it the year after that. So all that says is that that's positioned in a very compromised spot for him. But what is clear is the Pluto and Neptune transits, which you notice from these yellow markings. Pluto and Neptune are roaming around the late degrees of Pisces and Capricorn respectively. Yes, Pluto enters Aquarius briefly this year, a little more next year, and finally exits Capricorn and moves permanently into Aquarius at the end of 24, while Neptune is doing the same thing, late degrees of Pisces. The problem is, for Trump, is that these late degrees make 150s to his ascendant. That's two more major health connections, which I would interpret as very, very negative, the way that 150 tends to work. And in the case of Neptune, it's not just the ascendant. The points where it's earlier in the degrees, as is the case, for example, in this region here in 2023 in August, or down here in late 24, in other words, there's a lot of runway still, then it's doing the 150 to Mars. So basically it's either doing 150 to Mars or 150 to the ascendant, and Pluto 150 in this direction. This is a huge problem. So, bottom line, the summary to all this is, yes, I can agree with the possibility that he gets some kind of assistance at that point, and yet I would say the case for major trouble on the health front is even stronger. And indeed, both of those things could happen. However, if the health event is serious enough, then I don't think it's going to matter much what a judge does to help him, because that will tend to have more impact for obvious reasons.